Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is to take a truly monumental figure, a literary giant, and distill his extraordinary life and work into, well, the essential knowledge you need.
And we are diving into a writer who was somehow both the quietest government clerk in Cairo and one of the most explosive political voices in modern Arabic history.
We are talking about the life and legacy of Naguib Mahfouz, who lived from 1911 to 2006.
He is, to date, the only Egyptian to ever win the Nobel Prize in literature.
The only one.
The only one. But what makes his story truly captivating, I think, is the paradox. Here's a man of strict routine, of bureaucracy and stability, who produced fiction so challenging, so controversial, that it earned him global acclaim and resulted in a violent assassination attempt right outside his home in 1994.
Okay, let's unpack this monumental double life. Because when you look at the sheer scale of the sources, the 35 novels, over 350 short stories, 26 screenplays,
It's a huge body of work.
it just defies the image of a quiet, retiring civil servant. I mean, 70 years of continuous, insightful output.
It's an almost unbelievable volume. And the fact that he managed it all while holding down a government job for nearly 4 decades, that tells you everything you need to know about his dedication.
Right.
When he won the Nobel in 1988, the Swedish Academy's praise, I think, it just perfectly captured his achievement. They said he had formed an Arabian narrative art that applies to all mankind.
And that is the core theme we are following today. How do you find universal truth in the most local of settings?
For Mahfouz, the answer was always the Cairo lane. The sources really emphasize this concept of the Hara. For you listening, if you're not familiar with Old Cairo, the Hara isn't just a street. It's a self-contained, densely populated urban quarter, a labyrinth of winding, narrow, often dead-end alleyways.
That's the crucial distinction. The Hara is a place where tradition and communal life are, well, they're enforced by proximity. It's an isolated moral world, sometimes totally separate from the rush of the modern city just outside its boundaries.
So he used this specific, almost confining space as a complete microcosm of the entire world. Exactly. All human greed, faith, conflict, and love, it all played out in those narrow streets.
We're going to trace how he started by trying to write these massive, sweeping historical epics, and then realize that the profound stories, the ones that would resonate globally, were actually found right there in the everyday dust and drama of his own neighborhood. This is a deep dive into the making of a modern master. So let's start with the roots of the man who would chronicle modern Cairo. Naguib Mahfouz was born in 1911, and we have very specific origins that are just so central to his fiction. He wasn't from the modern European-style districts of Cairo, but deep inside the historical core.
Absolutely. He was born into a respectable lower-middle-class Muslim family in the Beit al-Qadi neighborhood, which is situated right in the Gamaleya quarter of Old Cairo.
Okay.
And this location, the heart of the old city, was his foundational environment. It was the geographical source material for his entire career. He grew up literally surrounded by the history he would later fictionalize.
And the detail about his name is such a fantastic piece of trivia. It really sets the stage for his life. His full compound given name was actually chosen in appreciation of a famous doctor.
Yes. His parents were so grateful to the well-known obstetrician, Naguib Pasha Mahfouz, who successfully oversaw his difficult birth, that they named their son in his honor.
Wow.
It's a subtle, but I think a potent detail because it connects him immediately to the highly educated, modern professional class, even though he grew up in such a traditional setting.
It's like a bridge.
It was a bridge between the ancient quarter and modern professionalism, a duality that just defined his career.
Now, if we look at his family structure, he was the 7th and youngest child, much, much younger than his 4 brothers and 2 sisters.
Yeah.
And the source material notes that experientially, he grew up feeling like an only child. That's a very unique position.
It is, and it creates the perfect conditions for an intense observer. When you're that much younger than your siblings, you are often, outside the main flow of activity.
Well, we were on the sidelines.
You're watching, listening, absorbing, rather than participating fully. This observational distance likely contributed to his later ability to capture and categorize the entire social structure of his neighborhood with such incredible precision.
And his intellectual upbringing was a profound study in contrasts. On the one hand, you have a strict Islamic foundation. His maternal grandfather was an Al-Azhar sheikh.
And for those unfamiliar, Al-Azhar is arguably the world's preeminent and most ancient seat of Sunni Islamic scholarship. That lineage carries enormous cultural and religious weight.
It absolutely does.
It means his understanding of faith and tradition was rigorous and deeply rooted. Yet, on the other hand, his mother, who was illiterate herself, played this unexpectedly modernizing role.
That's no sound.
She took him on these crucial cultural excursions to the Egyptian Museum to see the pharaonic artifacts and out to the pyramids. This tension between deep piety and ancient cultural curiosity became the foundational intellectual fuel for his work.
But the truly pivotal, the defining moment of his childhood wasn't philosophical or cultural. It was violent and political. The 1919 Egyptian Revolution.
He was only 7 years old, but he was exposed directly to the brutal reality of colonial oppression and street politics. He described witnessing British soldiers firing at demonstrators from his window.
Can you imagine?
He later reflected that this single event most shook the security of my childhood.
That experience immediately stripped away any remaining innocence or political naivete, didn't it? It must have politicized his consciousness at an extremely young age.
It had to. It forced him to confront colonialism, violence, and the struggle for national dignity right outside his home, which of course became the subject of his earliest works. The personal became immediately political for him.
And this early trauma was then reinforced by his later reading. He absorbed not only the towering Arabic literary figures like Taha Hussein, but also the crucial influence of the Fabian intellectual Salama Musa.
And that blend of traditional religious roots, socialist and secular intellectual thought, and that early political shock. It created a perfect, complex foundation for his political and psychological realism. He was positioned right at the intersection of modernizing, Western-influenced thought and deep-seated Egyptian tradition.
So if the 1919 revolution was the crucible of his political consciousness, the civil service was the great paradox of his professional life. This man, the Nobel laureate, was a dedicated bureaucrat.
And that fact is so often overlooked in biographies of literary giants. He graduated from Cairo University in 1934 with a philosophy degree. He did start work on his master's, but by 1936 he consciously stopped.
And just gave it up.
He decided to focus his professional energies on writing, and he needed a stable income to support that ambition. He chose the government office.
He was a civil servant for almost 4 decades, retiring only in 1971. A lifetime spent navigating the labyrinthine nature of Egyptian bureaucracy. I can't help but think that this job, so routinized, so focused on endless forms and official processes, was essential research for a writer dedicated to realism.
Absolutely. The bureaucracy became this silent, pervasive character in so many of his novels. It provided him with 2 critical things: financial stability, which let him write without the pressure of commercial success.
Which is huge for any artist.
Huge. And perhaps more importantly, it gave him an unparalleled front-row seat to the daily grind of ordinary people, the petty corruption, the arbitrary application of power, and the slow crushing of idealism. All classic themes in his later work. He saw exactly how the state apparatus functioned, or malfunctioned.
And his specific roles are fascinating because they put him right at the heart of the cultural and political life of the capital.
They did. He started as a clerk, but his career quickly ascended. In 1938, he moved to the Ministry of Islamic Endowments, the Al-Quaf, as a parliamentary secretary. This role gave him insight into the traditional religious institutions.
And then later he moved to the cultural sector.
That's right. He becomes director of censorship in the Bureau of Arts in the 1950s.
Director of censorship. That is the ultimate irony, isn't it? A man whose most important work would be banned across the Arab world was, for a time, responsible for deciding what art the public could consume.
The irony is rich, and it speaks to the complexity of his position within the cultural establishment. He later served as director of the Foundation for the Support of the Cinema, and finally retired as a consultant to the Ministry of Culture. He was deeply embedded in the cultural politics of post-revolutionary Egypt.
But the most striking example of his double life for me came in 1945, when he engineered a transfer that just blurred the line between civil service duty and artistic research.
This is where his bureaucratic duties provided the perfect cover for his art. In 1945, he requested a transfer to the Al Ghori Mausoleum Library. And while he was there, he engaged in what appeared to be an official government function, the Good Loans Project. Under the auspices of this project, he was authorized to conduct interviews with residents of his childhood neighborhood, the Gamaleya Quarter.
So he was, in effect, performing anthropological or journalistic research on his own childhood streets. using his government authority as a legitimate reason to knock on doors and gather detailed raw material.
Exactly. Material about the lives and stories of the people who would populate his greatest works, like Midak Alley.
It was genius. It gave him access and credibility that a mere writer might not have had. He wasn't just observing, he was documenting the texture of the Cairene lane, gathering the specific details, the anecdotes, the dialects that lend his mature work such a powerful sense of authenticity and place.
So no, the civil service career was not a distraction from his art. It was an essential investigative tool.
It's important to remember that the Naguib Mahfouz the world knows, the realist chronicler of the Hara, is not where he started. His initial ambition was, well, it was gargantuan, almost hilariously out of sync with his later style.
He was, initially, a historical romantic. He was inspired by the 19th century European master of historical fiction, Sir Walter Scott. And Mahfouz's grand vision was a sweeping 30-novel project that was intended to cover the entire history of Egypt, chronologically, from the pharaohs right up to the modern day.
30 novels dedicated to history. It sounds like a national endeavor, something you could spend a lifetime on, and frankly, a bit overwhelming.
And he only completed 3 novels in this vein, all focused on the pharaonic era. There's the historical trilogy, Abath Aliquar, or Mockery of the Fates, published in 1939, Rhodopis in 1943, which is a romance centered on a courtesan, and Kifatiba, or The Struggle of Thebes, in 1944.
All highly stylized, focused on these grand national dramas.
Very much so. But then, after the 3rd volume, came the crucial pivot. He completely abandoned the grand historical plan. This decision marks the birth of the Mahfouz we know.
It was a conscious rejection of that sweeping historical canvas in favor of intimacy.
Yes, his interest shifted entirely to contemporary settings, the modern life of Cairo, and most importantly, the psychological impact of rapid social and political change on ordinary Cairenes. This transition, around 1945, was his decisive turn toward realism.
It's such a powerful lesson in artistic focus. He moved from trying to capture the history of the entire nation across millennia to capturing the daily life of one street across decades.
And that narrowing of scope led to the universal significance the Nobel Committee later recognized.
The specifics became universal.
He realized that the human condition, the corruption, the idealism, the religious struggle, all of it could be explored more truthfully in the present-day struggles of a local community than in the glorious battles of ancient pharaohs.
So when we talk about his mature style, we have to emphasize that his domain was invariably Egypt, and specifically the lane. The Hara became his laboratory.
And this choice was radical. I mean, before Mahfouz, Arabic literature often focused on either poetry or this very formalized, high-minded literary prose. He grounded the novel in gritty social realism, using the ordinary vernacular and the struggles of the lower middle class.
It's a sociological precision.
It is. His novels show the same precision you'd expect from a study, detailing the architecture, the food, the daily rituals of the place.
And his technique was a true fusion. It proves he wasn't just mimicking European realism, but filtering it through an Arabian narrative lens.
That fusion is key to his modernity. He was deeply versed in traditional Arabic storytelling methods, the structure of a saga, the use of parables, but he also enthusiastically engaged with Western modernism. He consumed Western detective stories, Russian classics, and was heavily influenced by figures like Marcel Proust, Franz Kafka, and James Joyce.
How did the influence of writers like Kafka or Joyce manifest in the context of Old Cairo? That seems like a pretty big intellectual leap.
It was a technical mastery. From Joyce, he adopted techniques like stream of consciousness and the detailed internal monologue exploring the mental landscape of his characters.
Dig inside their heads.
Exactly. And from Kafka, he took the theme of bureaucratic alienation and the paranoia that comes from living under an invisible, seemingly arbitrary authority. He applied this psychological depth to the social tapestry of 20th century Egypt, making his realism simultaneously intimate and intellectually rigorous.
This technical richness then allowed him to tackle themes that were highly sensitive, even taboo, in mid-century Egypt. The sources highlight his blunt expression on some very controversial subjects.
He was fearless. He openly explored taboo subjects: poverty, illicit sexual relationships, political corruption, the disillusionment with socialism, and even homosexuality. He was willing to push boundaries, knowing full well that some of his work would be prohibited in Egypt, which it frequently was.
That commitment to unfiltered realism, even at personal cost, is just so central to his legacy.
It is. And this leads us directly to the existential layer beneath his realism. While he describes society in this granular detail, his characters are often grappling with a sense of meaninglessness or disconnection.
Right, so he's classified as a realist, but there's more going on.
Exactly. He was one of the first contemporary Arabic writers to actively embed existential themes. His characters are trying to cope with an extraordinarily rapid modernization process, the pull of Western values, and the breakdown of traditional faith. They're struggling with fundamental questions of fate, free will, and the meaning of existence in a world where old religious and political anchors are slipping away.
Let's take The Thief and the Dogs from 1961 as an example. It's realist in its depiction of a Marxist thief released from prison who's planning revenge, but the underlying tension is profoundly existential.
It explores the sense of utter betrayal. The thief, Seydou Maran, is seeking justice and purpose in a world that has just discarded him. And Mahfouz used this narrative to explore how humanity felt like it was moving further and further away from clarity and divine guidance during the cynical political climate of the 1960s.
So that loss of a moral compass, that alienation, that's the existential engine driving the plot forward.
Even as it looks like a simple crime drama on the surface.
Yes. So if the Nobel citation is the climax of his career, the Cairo Trilogy has to be the climax of his realism. This is the monumental work of the 1950s that really cemented his position as the chronicler of the city.
The trilogy is a saga of extraordinary scope and intimacy. It details the transition of Egyptian society. The 3 volumes, Palace Walk, Palace of Desire, and Sugar Street, are titled after the specific street names in the parts of Cairo where he grew up.
They depict the life of the family of the patriarch, El Said Ahmed Abdel Gawad, spanning 3 generations from World War I up until 1944. It's a powerful narrative about how tradition and patriarchy decay under the unrelenting pressure of modernization, nationalism, and shifting social mores.
It's the definitive work on the internal architecture of the Egyptian family. The first generation, strict and traditional, gives way to the second, which is political and nationalistic.
And then the third generation.
Which then gives way to the third, which is consumed by ideological struggle, socialism, secularism, and religious fundamentalism. It tracks the complete fragmentation of that foundational Cairene family unit.
Now, here's a surprising detail. After completing this massive, all-consuming project, Mahfouz actually stopped writing for some years. This wasn't writer's block, it was a deliberate pause.
It was a necessary reset. He stopped writing fiction between 1952 and 1959. When he returned, the Egyptian political landscape had been completely transformed by the 1952 Nasser Revolution, and his writing style had to change with it.
So his mid-career experimentation period begins in the 1960s and 70s.
That's it.
And how did his structure shift to reflect this new political complexity? The objective third-person saga structure of the trilogy seemed to give way to something much more fragmented.
That's right. He moved away from the large panoramic structure. He began constructing novels far more freely, heavily utilizing techniques like interior monologues or stream of consciousness.
So instead of an external narrator telling you what happened.
He burrowed deep into his characters' minds, allowing the reader to experience their chaotic, unedited internal thoughts. This signaled a shift from social realism to psychological realism.
And the clearest example of this structural and political experimentation has to be Miramar from 1967. This novel just perfectly captures the disillusionment of the post-Nasser revolutionary period.
Miramar is a masterpiece of structural innovation. It takes place in an Alexandria pension, a boarding house, and it centers around an attractive servant girl, Zara, who represents the nation itself. But the story isn't told by a single authoritative voice.
No, it uses 4 first-person narrators.
4 separate voices, each with their own biases and political baggage.
Can you break those down for us?
Sure. You have the aging intellectual who is nostalgic for the past, the skeptical observer, the frustrated socialist who still believes in the revolution's ideals, and the corrupt Nasserite opportunist who is simply profiting from the new regime.
And each of them tells the story of Zara, the nation, from their own limited, self-serving perspective.
Exactly. And by using multiple, inherently unreliable narrators, Mahfouz wasn't just being modernist, he was illustrating a crucial thematic point. That the truth about Egypt in the 1960s was fragmented, contested, and impossible to pin down through any single authoritative ideology.
It captured the ideological breakdown. Post-revolution, everyone claimed to speak for the nation, but the truth was hidden somewhere in the messy overlap and contradictions of their stories.
And this reliance on multiple viewpoints was a crucial mechanism for criticizing the regime without openly attacking it, which was a very dangerous act at the time.
And while he was exploring these cutting-edge modernist forms, he also circled back to traditional Arabic roots, using classic storytelling as a framework for modern critiques.
Yes, showing the full range of his mastery. In works like Arabian Nights and Days from 1979 and The Journey of Ibn Fattuma in 1983, he consciously borrowed from the structure of classic Arabic storytelling using parables and allegories to mask profound political and philosophical critiques. Even his historical work, Akhenaten, Dweller in Truth, used that ancient conflict to discuss religious truths in modern Egypt.
For Mahfouz, literature was never far from the public square. He stated very clearly that his work was fundamentally political.
He acknowledged it directly. He said, "In all my writings you will find politics. You may find a story which ignores love or any other subject, but not politics. It is the very axis of our thinking."
Which makes sense considering his first formative memory was the violent 1919 revolution.
It does. His early political ideals aligned with the nationalist movement. He sympathized with the Waft Party, which was the leading nationalist party in the struggle for independence. And of course, the socialist and democratic ideals he absorbed from Salama Musa were deeply integrated into his contemporary novels.
Those socialist ideals are reflected in early contemporary novels like Al-Khalili and New Cairo, but parallel to his sympathy for democratic socialism was a strong and enduring antipathy towards religious extremism and authoritarianism.
And that tension is made particularly personal by his early relationship with Sayyid Qutb.
Right. For those listening who might not be familiar, Qutb became one of the most significant foundational ideologues of the Muslim Brotherhood and modern political Islam.
What's fascinating is that in the 1940s, Qutb was actually a literary critic and was one of the first influential voices to recognize and praise Mahfouz's talent. They moved in the same circles.
So this early connection, Qutb, the literary figure turning into Qutb, the radical ideologue, it mirrors the exact shift in Egyptian society that Mahfouz was chronicling.
It does. He even visited Qutb in the hospital in the 1960s, showing a continued complex connection. Yet Mahfouz later painted a critical portrait of him in his semi-autobiographical novel Mirrors, illustrating his firm political and ideological break with radical Islamic ideology as Qutb's influence grew.
So, regarding the 1952 revolution, Mahfouz was initially supportive of the principles of national liberation, social justice promoted by Gamal Abdel Nasser.
But as Nasser consolidated power, Mahfouz became profoundly disappointed when the practices of the regime, the authoritarianism, the suppression of democracy failed to live up to those original ideals.
And that disillusionment led to direct literary criticism, which must have taken immense courage during Nasser's time.
It did. His 1966 novel, Adrift on the Nile, Harthura Fok al-Nil, is perhaps the clearest example. It focuses on a group of middle and upper-class Egyptians who gather regularly on a houseboat to smoke hashish and escape the moral and political realities of the country.
The hashish generation.
Exactly. A decadent, morally adrift, and politically apathetic society that Mahfouz saw emerging under the revolutionary government. It was a searing critique of the revolutionary elite who had lost their way.
And the novel was so sensitive that, ironically, it was later banned by the Sadat regime.
Right. Not because it criticized Sadat, but precisely to avoid provoking those who still revered Nasser. The government was trying to manage the narrative legacy of the previous leader. Copies of that banned book were extremely difficult to find in Egypt until the late 1990s.
Yeah, it just shows how deeply entangled his art was with contemporary power struggles. So, while Adrift on the Nile was a subtle political critique, his 1959 novel, Children of Gebelawi, was a theological and social allegory so explosive that it led to consequences that lasted for decades.
This is the novel that ultimately led to the attack on his life. It's a sweeping, deeply allegorical work that attempts to understand faith, power, and the relationship between humanity and the divine through the lens of the Cairo Hara.
Can you detail the plot for us? How did it manage to incite such fury?
The plot revolves around a patriarch named Gebelawi who lives in a large mansion at the end of the alley. His children and subsequent generations live lives that directly parallel the narratives of the monotheistic Abrahamic faiths.
So you have characters who correspond to Cain and Abel, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad.
That's right. And by allegorically portraying God Gebelawi and the founding figures of the Abrahamic faiths, he was essentially subjecting them to literary human analysis, placing them within the flaws and struggles of the Cairene lane.
The text itself is a societal critique, isn't it? On the failure of divine guidance to solve human problems.
It is. It argues instead for human scientific inquiry to alleviate suffering. There's a famous passage that describes the community's despair. It says, whenever someone is depressed, suffering, or humiliated, he points to the mansion at the top of the alley and says, sadly, That is our ancestor's house. We are all his children. Why are we starving? What have we done?
It's a powerful metaphor for humanity's estrangement from justice. And the result was, of course, alleged blasphemy. It was banned in Egypt immediately and throughout the entire Arab world, except for Lebanon.
And it remained banned in his home country until 2006. That ban forced him into a unique position. He was a celebrated Arab writer who couldn't even publish his most controversial work in his own nation.
But the controversies didn't stop there. His political decisions in the 1970s also earned him the ire of the pan-Arab world. We're referring to his public support for President Anwar al-Sadat's 1978 Camp David peace treaty with Israel.
That's right. Because he supported the peace treaty, a monumental political decision, Mahfouz's books were instantly banned in many other Arab countries. It essentially turned him into an intellectual exile across the region.
And that ban was only lifted after he won the Nobel Prize 10 years later.
Which just illustrates how often political loyalty superseded artistic achievement in the Middle East.
And this leads us to the moment where he took the ultimate intellectual stand, the Salman Rushdie affair in 1989. After Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa calling for Rushdie's death over the satanic verses, Mahfouz had to respond.
And his response was incredibly courageous and deeply nuanced. It reflected his commitment to intellectual freedom above all else. Mahfouz stated that he personally found the satanic verses insulting to Islam, demonstrating his respect for his faith. However, he publicly condemned Ayatollah Khomeini as a terrorist for issuing the death sentence.
He upheld the absolute principle of freedom of expression, even for a book he personally disagreed with.
He joined 80 other intellectuals in declaring that no blasphemy harms Islam and Muslims so much as the call for murdering a writer. It was a clear, unequivocal defense of the intellectual's right to live and write freely.
But it also painted a massive target on his back, linking him directly to the most prominent free speech controversy of the time.
That defense, combined with the revived decades-old controversy around children of Gebelawi, sealed his fate in the eyes of extremists. He began receiving death threats, including one from the notorious blind sheikh, Omar Abdelrahman.
And those threats became tragically real on October 14, 1994. The 82-year-old Mahfouz was stabbed in the neck outside his Cairo home by a religious extremist.
It was the extreme price paid in flesh and blood for holding an intellectual line.
The attack itself was brutal, but what was the long-term cost to the writer?
He thankfully survived, but the consequences were devastating to his craft. He sustained a permanent nerve damage to his right upper limb. The result was that the man who had authored 35 novels could now only manage to write for a few minutes a day.
Unbelievable.
This severely curtailed his output for the remaining 12 years of his life.
That is an image that stays with you. The Nobel laureate, the great chronicler of his age, reduced to living under constant bodyguard protection until his death in 2006. He was often confined to his lawyer's office, using the library there for reference, unable to roam the beloved streets he immortalized.
It's the ultimate illustration of the conflict between radical ideology and intellectual freedom. Yet, in a final, profound act of vindication, his most controversial work, Children of Gebelawi, was finally published in Egypt in early 2006, just months before his passing in August of that year.
47 years after it was written, the book that inspired the attack on his life was finally available in his own nation, resolving the decades-long ban just as his life drew to a close. Let's pivot to the private man, because this part of his life is just as contradictory as his public one. Despite being this explosive public intellectual, he maintained an almost obsessively secretive and routinized domestic life.
His whole adult life was structured around protecting his writing time. He remained a bachelor until the relatively late age of 43, marrying in 1954.
And his reasoning was brutally pragmatic for an artist.
Completely. He feared that marriage, with its numerous restrictions and limitations, would consume his time and hamper his literary future. He put it quite plainly, saying he was afraid of drowning in visits and parties.
He saw the obligations of married life and extended family as a direct threat to the dedicated solitude he needed for creation.
Which is why he married quietly. He chose a Coptic Orthodox woman from Alexandria, Atiyatullah Ibrahim, and they had 2 daughters, Fatima and Kulthum. The fact that he married outside the Muslim community was a quiet statement in itself.
But he kept it intensely private.
Intensely. He avoided public exposure and firmly dismissed any journalist or interviewer who inquired about his domestic sphere, calling it a silly topic in journals and radio programs.
So he constructed a fiercely guarded domestic shield so he could be the explosive, controversial intellectual in the public sphere.
Precisely. His dedication to routine was legendary. He wrote every morning, attended his civil service job, and then spent his evenings socializing with a tight circle of literary friends at specific cafes. This was his sanctuary, predictable structure, protecting the revolutionary content.
And one final quirk,
Mm-hmm.
his distinct dislike of travel. Here was a writer deemed universal by the Nobel Committee, but he rarely left Egypt.
He felt his creative wellspring was in Cairo. He once said that if he left, he'd be cut off from his source material. Belgrade was noted as one of the few foreign cities he visited gladly and respected. But, for the most part, his universe was the Hara, and his journey was internal.
Decades after his most prolific output, Naguib Mahfouz remains a cornerstone of modern Egyptian culture. His works are continually republished, and he's studied across the Arab world and globally.
He is the foundational figure in contemporary Arabic prose. But the most powerful testament to his enduring impact is the continuous adaptation of his works into visual media. His blend of intimate human drama and underlying philosophical conflict translates perfectly to film and television.
His books are constantly adapted into films and TV series, not just in Egypt, but internationally. And this is where that Nobel citation, applies to all mankind, really proves itself true.
The prime example is the 1995 Mexican film El Callejón de los Milagros, which is a beautiful adaptation of his novel Medak Alley,
Starring Salma Hayek.
starring Salma Hayek, and it shifts the setting completely from a Cairene Hara to a central plaza in Mexico City.
Which is proof that the human dramas of Medak Alley, the conflicts between tradition and modernity, idealism and cynicism, the struggle for love and dignity, are universal, regardless of the language spoken or the continent.
And locally, his influence on Egyptian television is undeniable. Series like Afra al-Kuba, Bain el-Samawa el-Ard, and Hadith al-Sabawa al-Masa are still highly popular adaptations. His stories continue to serve as a shared narrative, shaping how Egyptians view their own history, their social structures, and their political upheavals.
And for you listening, if you want to engage physically with his world, there is now a permanent marker tying his fiction back to his reality.
The Naguib Mahfouz Museum opened by the Ministry of Culture in 2019 in Old Cairo. It's situated near the Wakala of Al-Ghuri, Muz Street, and the Azhar Mosque, the very arteries of the Gamaleya quarter where the bulk of his novels take place.
It allows you to walk through the physical space of the fictional lane. You can see the artifacts of the man, his desk, his trademark hat, his photographs, and of course the Nobel medal, creating a direct, tangible link between the quiet civil servant and the revolutionary chronicler who saw the entire world within a few square blocks of Old Cairo.
It's an extraordinary life, isn't it? The sheer duality of Naguib Mahfouz, the dedicated civil servant, the philosophical graduate who harnessed his bureaucratic stability to become the most important chronicler of 20th century societal and political change in Egypt.
A writer who was attacked in the street for his commitment to artistic freedom and allegorical truth. He transformed the concept of realism in Arabic letters, forcing a dynamic engagement with modernity, existential questions, and political responsibility. He's a singular figure in world literature.
He really is. His narrative art was born from an intimate knowledge of the everyday chaos of Cairo.
So what's the ultimate takeaway here? What does Mahfouz's career tell us about the process of finding lasting, universal truth? Well, think back to his initial grand ambition, his 30-novel plan to cover the sweeping, epic history of Egypt, inspired by the historical grandeur of Sir Walter Scott.
And that project failed.
It failed.
Yeah.
He wrote 3 historical novels and then stopped. He realized that the sheer weight of history made the narrative thin.
Yet, he achieved that monumental, enduring, universal significance applies to all mankind only when he dramatically, consciously reduced his scope. He abandoned the need to capture the historical narrative of the entire empire and chose instead to focus entirely on the chaotic, flawed, deeply human specifics of a single Cairene lane.
It forces you to consider this. The surest path to grasping the universal human condition, or the political essence of an entire civilization, is often not found in the grand halls of power or sweeping historical timelines, but by examining the microscopically small details of a single localized life. Sometimes the lane holds more history than the capital.
Find the universal truth in the most local of details. That is the genius and the enduring hard-won legacy of Naguib Mahfouz.
The deep dive complete. We'll see you next time.